I want to welcome you all this afternoon to our monthly program for the Riley County Genealogical Society. I'm Jenny Peterson. I'm currently the president, so it's my honor to be able to introduce our speaker today. This is the second in our series this year of talks about the early history and the continuing history of Manhattan and different events here that tie into the new plaques we're going to be putting up along the linear trail, identifying spots. So our programs and our plaques are tied together. We're pleased to have the Chapman Center with us as one of the partners in this project. And Mary's back there with her camera today, recording some of it, because a lot of things will be on their website about this project as we go forward. So you'll have to keep that in mind with the Chapman Center. But today our program is given to us by Allana Parker, who is originally from Augusta, Kansas. She has a BS in history along with a minor in leadership studies from K-State and an MA in museum studies from the University of Kansas. She served as Curator of Design with the Riley County Historical Museum for 10 years and currently serves as Treasurer of the Kansas Museums Association and member of the Kansas State Historical Society Foundation Board. She's also on the committee for the Walking Through History on the Linear Trail project that I just mentioned. And she's the graphic designer for the pull-ups you're going to be seeing around town advertising the exhibit. They'll be traveling to different places around Manhattan over the next months as we go forward with this project. And she's also the designer for the graphics and the wording for the markers. In other words, she's very involved in this project. And we're very, very pleased to have her talk to us today about the subject before you, forming a free state Manhattan in Kansas Territory. So Allana, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I probably should have adjusted this beforehand. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'll be sure to speak loudly too. Well, good afternoon. It is wonderful to see you all. Thank you for coming. I don't think it's turned on. Okay. I wonder if it gets turned on. Yeah, I wonder if it gets on. There's a hard one. You can use one. That might be better. Thank you. Is this a little better? Okay, excellent. Thank you. Well, again, thank you very much for coming, and I also, I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to present today. I absolutely love Riley County and Manhattan history. I love the stories, the people, the primary sources that we have that help tell these stories are just incredible. And I know all of you love Riley County and Manhattan history. So I also want to invite anytime if there's anything that comes up, if you have a question or an interjection, I think that's what's fun about these programs is to be able to all share these stories. This is such a big story too, talking about the founding of our town of Manhattan here. I know I've got an hour. I'm going to try to keep it under that. I think you could probably do several programs on this topic alone. So I will go ahead and get started. And again, thank you so much for coming today. So to begin, of course, as I mentioned, Manhattan-Riley County has such a rich history filled with remarkable people, even from its earliest years. During the first few years of Riley County's existence, a number of towns developed as pioneers moved into the vicinity. This included town sites of Polistra, Canton, New Boston, and ultimately the city we know and love today as Manhattan. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to cover those events and the individuals around the early founding of our town and through the letters and diaries of early pioneers and some of those landmarks that we still find in our community today. So to begin from the start of opening of Kansas Territory, on May 30th, 1854, Kansas Territory was officially established when President Franklin Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act into law, repealing the Missouri Compromise. Congressional debate on the act continued discussion of whether or not slavery would be permitted to expand in the newly opened territories. The principle of popular sovereignty, some believed, offered the solution. It allowed the residents of the territory to decide through democratic process whether their state constitution would permit slavery.
Kansas Territory, because of its proximity to Missouri, a slaveholding state, became a battleground both politically and literally for pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Contested elections, armed conflict, and recruitment of support from settlers with sympathies to the North and the South contributed to the label Bleeding Kansas. The battle for Kansas was also waged in the halls of Congress. As I'm sure many are familiar with the caning of Charles Sumner on the floor of Senate in 1856 there. In the national press and elsewhere in the country where people gathered to discuss or debate the issues of the day. Tensions of the growing conflict were also felt right here in what would become Manhattan. Soon after the territory opened, settlers from both the South, including Missouri, and the North came to Kansas. The settlers from the North generally opposed slavery here in Kansas. So to begin, one of our first European settlers in what would become Manhattan was Samuel Dyer. Dyer operated a ferry crossing and shortly thereafter a government bridge on the Big Blue River on the military trail that ran from Fort Leavenworth to Fort Riley, which of course was established in 1853. Unfortunately, there are not any known photographs that we have of that ferry or the government bridge, but it's wonderful that we do have this, and this is actually an old postcard here, remnants of that old government bridge at Juniata. So the settlement, as I mentioned, known as Juniata, that is what it became known as. As a native Tennessean, Dyer's Juniata became a predominantly pro-slavery settlement, though he was initially thought of as a free state Democrat. In 1856, ice and flooding on the Big Blue River destroyed the bridge, and with the loss of the crossing and the perception of Juniata standing as a pro-slavery community when a majority of the other settlements in the area were free state communities, the remaining families of Juniata moved to Manhattan and the old settlement abandoned. So extremely short-lived there for Juniata. So in the fall of 1854, George S. Park, a land speculator from Parkville, Missouri, established the first European-American claim in what would become Manhattan. Park, a Vermont native and veteran of the Texas War of Independence, traveled on the steamboat Excel in June of 1854 to Kansas Territory in hopes of financial gain. Returning home 5 months later, Park ventured back to Kansas Territory and marked out the town site of Polistra, and with the assistance of Reverend Charles Blood and Seth Child, erected a cabin near the junction of the Kansas River and Wildcat Creek. So according to Donald Parrish, author of This Land is Our Land, the original name of the town of Polistra, which you might have also seen, there are different spellings and pronunciations, whether it's Polistra, Polistra. And I actually saw there were 4 different ways that it was spelled or pronounced. But Polistra came from the Greek meaning location of a political place or central city. I did want to talk a little bit about Park, though, in his background. So in 1853, Park started the Industrial Luminary, a newspaper that he had high hopes of moving to Polistra. But Park's newspaper was raided back east in Parkville by a pro-slavery mob on April 14, 1855, and his printing press was actually thrown into the Missouri River. And what's neat about this photograph here, so there's Parkville, Missouri. He also started Park University, or Park College, that became Park University there. But you can see the river right back behind the building there. And I was watching a video, it was from the archives of Park University, and the archivist there said that the printing press was located just right in the corner of the building, so it was easier for them just to throw it right there in the river. Just really neat piece of history, that connection there with Parkville, and then him coming here to what would become Manhattan. So with his interest, as I mentioned, in education, Park in 1858 pledged $500, which would be around $20,000 today, toward establishing Bluemont Central College, which we know as Kansas State University today. So neat connections there with George Park. So next we're going to move on to Samuel Dexter Houston, which the second settlement of Manhattan in the Manhattan area was named Canton. Established by abolitionist Samuel Dexter Houston, which no relation to the Houston of Houston, Texas. So a little bit about Sam Houston. Born in Columbus, Ohio in 1818, Houston traveled to Kansas Territory in the spring of 1854 with his wife Tabitha Kimball and family to their pioneer home with the goal of helping Kansas into the Union as a free state. I think that's also interesting looking at many of the settlers that came here to establish the town of Manhattan. There were those that were interested in financial gain, and there were many of those, this area specifically, who came here to help Kansas become a free state. And Samuel Dexter Houston and his family were part of that group. So in March of 1855, Houston was elected to the first territorial legislature as a free state candidate at Pawnee, and in 1859 served as a member of the Wyandotte Convention that framed the Kansas Constitution, which was adopted later that year. Historical records show that in the fall of 1854, Samuel arranged for 4 free staters to meet him at the foot of Bluemont Hill, and here they founded the town site of Canton. And I think this is a great illustration. This is a map by Elizabeth Sokolowski from This Land is Our Land. And it might be difficult to see, but I did have circled there. So where we have Bluemont Hill and Canton, just as I mentioned, described, right there at the foot of Bluemont Hill. But you can see the former channels of the river too. So that's what we're looking at here, the former channels before the flood, the 1903 flood, which changed the course. So you can see it was initially right there on the river. Together, these 5 men organized the Canton Company, claiming a quarter section of land at the base of Bluemont Hill, a little west of the mouth of the Blue, fronting on the Kansas. Houston had marked the date of his claim on a cottonwood tree earlier that year. I think that's all it took. Their only improvement for the town site at that time was a dugout at the base of the hill. In 1857, Houston relocated his claim with his family on Wildcat Creek and built a house that still stands today at 3624 Anderson Avenue here in Manhattan. And this is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. A wonderful photograph here. And there you can see, this is a photo from around 2018. A beautiful home, and it's just been beautifully preserved. So back in New England, the talk of the town was centered on the Kansas question. And I think this is an interesting article. This is from May 1855 from the Washington Union. What is to be the end of the Kansas question? And it's wonderful with technology today, the newspapers that we can access, not only here in Kansas, but looking at what's going on in other states at that time. And of course, if you look at newspapers, especially this one here, the Washington Union, others in New England, Kansas was the big headline of the day, and going through those newspapers really illustrated that. So as tension mounted across the country, Eli Thayer of Massachusetts devised a plan to prevent slavery from spreading into Kansas. He believed that if enough anti-slavery supporters settled in the territory, they could capture the vote and make Kansas a free state. 1 month before the Kansas-Nebraska Act became law, Thayer and other prestigious New England businessmen incorporated the New England Immigrant Aid Company. This company secured low-cost transportation for immigrants and provided temporary housing for settlers once they reached Kansas territory. So 2 individuals that took advantage of this opportunity to help Kansas become a free state was Isaac and Ellen Goodnow. So ardent abolitionists Isaac and Ellen Goodnow seized this opportunity with Eli Thayer's group to head out west to Kansas. Goodnow was born in 1814 in Whittingham, Vermont, and raised in New England. After the death of his father in 1828, so at just 14 years old, Goodnow delayed his education and worked as a clerk. He eventually graduated from Wilbraham Wesleyan Academy in Wilbraham, Massachusetts in 1838. Also this year, he married Ellen Dennison Goodnow. So in 1848, Goodnow accepted a position as a professor of natural sciences at the Providence Conference Seminary in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. He retained this position until December 1854, when he resigned very abruptly at the age of 40 to move to Kansas Territory to support the creation of a free state town with the New England Immigrant Aid Company. And in Isaac's journal, which another beautiful piece of history, you can read these journals. There are some on the Riley County Historical Museum website. You can read the early 1850 years. If you go to the Kansas State Historical Society website, they have, I believe, there might be some from the 1840s, and then to almost his passing, the 1890s. He is missing 1 year, I want to mention, because apparently he left his journal while he was traveling on the railroad, and for that year, his journal was never seen again. But aside from that, you can read all of his diaries have been digitized through Kansas Memory on the Kansas State Historical Society. But I wanted to share this quote because I think this really embodies why he came here to Kansas. He wrote, "Believing that the rule of slavery or of freedom in the nation would be settled on the prairies of Kansas, I felt impelled to throw myself onto the scale on the side of freedom." I think that's just such a beautiful and telling quote, why Isaac and Ellen decided to come to Kansas. So Goodnow had been a committed abolitionist since at least 1840. After hearing this speech by Eli Thayer, he felt immediately the need to go to Kansas Territory. So after he made this decision, he also began writing editorials and letters encouraging others to join the cause to come to Kansas. So on March 6, 1855, Goodnow and 76 other Free Staters left Boston, Massachusetts on a 4-day train trip to Alton, Illinois, near St. Louis, Missouri. From Alton, they continued for 8 days on the steamboat Kate Swinney from St. Louis across the Missouri River to Kansas City. And this photograph here, I was so excited to find this photograph. It might be a little difficult to read. This is a view of the Kate Swinney steamboat. And we know which one's the Kate Swinney because you can see the KS on the top of the smokestacks there. So this was taken around 1853, so just shortly before Isaac and his crew were on that steamboat. But I love it. You know these steamboats are heading out west. Look at the pile of chairs, all of the trunks, the horses hauling everything for those who are staying there. Just a wonderful photograph, knowing that these abolitionists were on this very steamboat. I also wanted to mention another part from Isaac's diary. So he wrote, quote, "Our trip up the Missouri of 8 days on the Kate Swinney, Captain Chateau, was a remarkably pleasant one. We had 120 immigrants with about 100 U.S. cavalry with a fine band of music. For a wonder, almost everybody was Free State, and we had our own way in everything." So I let you know they had the numbers there coming out here out west. He wrote, "Luke P. Lincoln, our superintendent, was a fine singer and organized a glee club which sang the songs of liberty." So this quote is from his personal reminiscence there. So on March 18th, Goodnow's party reached Kansas City, where Goodnow met with the company's representative, Samuel C. Pomeroy, and decided to form the company's new settlement at the junction of the Kansas and Blue River. So here again, that same map, so you can see, just to give you perspective, so there we had Canton formed, Polistra, and then where Goodnow's group decided to settle. So on March 20th, 1855, Goodnow and the 5 men departed Kansas City on the military road from Fort Leavenworth to Fort Riley, ahead of the rest of the group as an exploring party. On March 24th, 1855, Goodnow's party reached the government bridge that crossed the Blue River at Juniata. So even though he determined that it was an attractive site for a town, Goodnow was concerned that there were too few trees for building and for fuel. And we do have, I wish I would have included some, in the Riley County Historical Society Museum's collection, there are some early photographs of Manhattan, how barren it is. In fact, one of my favorite quotes in talking about Sunset Cemetery, there's a woman who said, "I do not want to be buried here on this bleak and desolate hill." Which of course we know Sunset Cemetery today with its beautiful trees, and we look at Blue Mont Hill, we see those trees, but to imagine what it looked like back then. So this was obviously a significant concern with the lack of trees and ways to build housing and to have fuel for all the parties that came. So here is an example of one of those digitized pages from Isaac's diary. I will say, If you are trying to read them, his handwriting is not the best. I think I've given myself a headache on a couple occasions in trying to read his diary, but it's just a great resource to have. So I wanted to share a few passages from his diary. So February 20th, 1855, this is before he left for Kansas Territory. He said, visited at home today, Kansas, the all-engrossing subject. Again, emphasizing this was the talk of the town back in New England. So Saturday, this is March 24th, 1855, rode 18 miles, built a fire, and dined on home cookery. Very windy, which I thought was appropriate for Kansas. Walked to a mound on the Blue, commanding one of the most delightful views imaginable. Saw the sunset. Again, then he says, on March 25th, 1855, very windy. Talked over matters with Reverend Mr. B relative to future duties. The responsibilities of my position almost pressed me down. Had I no one to decide for only myself, I could easily bear it. The country here is magnificent. Oh, the moonlit scenery. So on April 3rd, the settlers met to formalize the founding of the town site and establish the new Boston Town Association and officially named it as such. Isaac was one of 36 to be made part of the original charter. At the same meeting, Isaac was elected vice president for the association. This is from the Kansas State University Special Collections. So appreciative that these materials are made available to help tell these stories. So this is actually the Constitution of the Boston Association. This was passed down to Harriet Parkerson, who was Isaac's niece, whom he and his wife adopted. And then she in turn gave it to another individual who then donated it to the Special Collections at K-State. But it's just wonderful to see on the next page here, a list of names for the Boston Association. Some I believe will sound very familiar. Here you can see E.M. Thurston, S.D. Houston, there's H.A. Wilcox, Goodnow, Lovejoy I will speak about in just a little bit, but a lot of familiar names. We see a lot of our street names from this list here. So upon their settlement in Manhattan, I should back up, I apologize. Initially, so I think many are probably familiar with the Goodnow House State Historic Site. Before they lived in that home, they actually lived in a small cabin on Wildcat Creek. So around where the Dream Car Museum is today, that is around where their cabin initially stood. So during this time, oh, I'm sorry.
You know, you've got the $20, $2 that's coming down. Were these donations made for founding the
Correct, yes,
community,
to my
or?
knowledge, yes.
Okay.
So during this time, Isaac notes in his diary his efforts to keep men from returning home to New England as they faced the struggles of pioneer life. And there were a few here that did. They said, this is too difficult, I'm going home. Just imagining, I looked at some photographs of what Isaac's home looked like at the time. He and Ellen left New England, the Boston area, the conveniences, I'll use that word, as much as could be in 1855. Coming out here to Kansas is almost another world, to think of how they had to live. And I'll go into some additional details in some of the diary entries here, but that was something that Isaac took upon himself. He was really a primary factor in encouraging people to stay here and to give it a chance. But I want to move now because there are also, as I mentioned, the political elements, what's happening in Kansas Territory at the time. So after Kansas Territory opened for settlement in 1854, President Franklin Pierce appointed Andrew Reeder to be the first governor of Kansas Territory. Most people believed he would support slavery in the new territory. Reeder, however, supported the concept of popular sovereignty, letting the residents of Kansas Territory decide whether slavery would be allowed, as I previously mentioned. So Governor Reeder called for the first election shortly after he arrived in the territory. That spring, several pro-slavery Missourians crossed the border to vote illegally in the first legislative election held on March 30th, 1855. This resulted in what became known as the bogus legislature. But I love this quote here. This is from Isaac Goodnow's diary. He said, "Election day voted for freedom," and it is underlined in his diary there. "With some 15 of our company, Mr. Houston, our representative, elected. Missourians armed with guns, revolvers came on and ordered us to move, compromise the matter to our satisfaction. And I love that last line because as you read Isaac's diary, you really get a sense of his personality. And I could just see him, the way his demeanor is, really, here you have Missourians who are armed, trying to force them out of the area. And I could just see Isaac, with his polite nature, they were able to convince otherwise, and things went smoothly as far as we understand in this entanglement here with Isaac. But going back to the bogus legislature and why it was named such, I think this really illustrates. So here we know a majority of those who settled here were free staters. Here are our free state votes. Here are our pro-slavery votes. So considering the total voting population in Kansas Territory at the time was just over 2,900, you can see we have a little bit of a problem. So 5,000 Missourians came over here to Kansas just to vote, and it wasn't just here in these elections, it was all throughout Kansas Territory. And of course, many know Lawrence and what Lawrence experienced at this time. But I think this is just a great illustration of, yes, we had a very serious problem during that first territorial election. So the bogus legislature met in Pawnee near Fort Riley. Governor Reeder picked the town of Pawnee for several reasons. First, he wanted the legislature to be far away from the influences of Missouri, which did not quite work out that way. Another reason was that Reeder was an investor in the city of Pawnee. So when the pro-slavery legislature arrived, the building they were to meet in had no floor, roof, windows, or doors yet. Although there was some lodging available, most of these legislators stayed in tents. They had determined a permanent seat of government, created a constitution, and decided if Kansas was to be free or a slave state. And a wonderful photograph here of Pawnee. And then you can see it is still available today to tour. So here's just a modern day photograph here of the first territorial capital of Kansas.
So the first picture was how it was when they met there?
Yes, without the roof, windows, doors, or floor. You can see they did eventually get the roof.
That's very nice.
Yes. So the legislature met in Pawnee for only 4 days. One of its major actions was to unseat all of the anti-slavery members. This, of course, angered the Free Staters. It was later reported that one anti-slavery legislator responded, quote, "Gentlemen, this is a memorable day, and may become more so. Your acts will be the means of lightening the watchfires of war in our land," which is, I think, a very powerful quote leading up to what we know happened here in territorial Kansas. So the territory gained a violent reputation. The turmoil in Kansas contributed to the growing tension between the North and the South, eventually leading to the Civil War. I am going to go back now to the Goodnoes, but wanted to paint a picture of what's going on at the time that these settlements are occurring here in what would become Manhattan. So the Goodnoe house, so Isaac and Ellen constructed a home. It started in 1860. So the original portion of their 1860 home is here. And then they did have 2 additions added on. Of course, we know this today as the Goodnoe House State Historic Site. In his diary, he noted, this is February 12, 1861, when they actually purchased the home. Went to Manhattan, finished up the trade with J.F. Currier, buying a house and 6 acres of land for $800. $300 down and $500 to be paid May 1st, 1861. And I wanted to give an example, too, of what Manhattan looked like at the time. Of course, this is what we know as one of the earliest photographs of Manhattan. This was taken around 1863, so just under 10 years after they settled here. But looking at, this is Queens Avenue. You can see the trees, that would be where the river stood. But looking at all the wagons coming through, heading out west, I think is a great illustration. But this is where you could find lodging here in Manhattan. Dugout homes. This is a dugout photograph from the 1880s. So even into the 1880s, Raleigh Countyans are still living in dugout homes. So the fact that Isaac and Ellen had this beautiful limestone home that they lived in And I love the story of the Goodnose home with the construction of the chimney. Ellen had a lot to do with the home's construction. So that window that you see centered, initially the plans had not been in place to have that window on that south side of the home. So in order to accommodate the window, the builders, which Ellen was insistent on having, the builders had to build the chimney around Ellen's window, so she has permanently left her mark on the home. Just a few other views, the barn that was built in 1869. No farmhouse would be complete without the outhouse, and it is really incredible. When it rains heavily, it does wash out some of the dirt in some of the areas around the Goodnoe house. We lovingly refer to it as the Goodnoe dump. Of course, you would dig a hole and your trash would go into the hole. Sometimes you can see those remnants washing up or where the privy stood. The wonderful thing about the home too, a majority of the artifacts in the home belong to Isaac or Ellen or their adopted niece, Harriet. So what you see here is his desk. His inkwell there is sitting on that portion of the desk there. On the very top, that is a ballot box. So I just love thinking about how involved Isaac was, how much he wrote, him sitting at this desk writing to help Kansas become a free state, writing back to the East, which he did frequently, and these red letters are available to me. As a professor of sciences, his collection of geology, that is still on display there. This is just a small portion of his collections. I will say they're not just Isaac's. Ellen was exceptionally educated in the natural sciences as well. And in reading through the local newspapers, you can see where she is referred to as an expert in the field of geology, which I just think is incredible. And then a view of the house here. It's a very New England architecturally. Of course, that would make sense where they came from. Home where Isaac and Ellen did a lot of their work here. And I did also want to mention briefly Bluemont Central College, which Isaac and Ellen were two of the original founders of Bluemont Central College. This photograph taken around 1860. And some of the primary source materials that help tell the story of Bluemont Central College. So here's one of the letters written by Isaac Goodnoe. It is written to a man named William Claflin, who he addresses as dear brother. And just to summarize the letter, essentially what Isaac is saying is, if you donate money to help us start this college, because Isaac was actively soliciting back in New England to try to get the funds to start Bluemont Central College. So Isaac says, you donate money, we will name a building after you as part of the campus. Well, that didn't really pan out, but they didn't name a building, but they did name the street that would run right by the college, Claflin Avenue. So I just love that. Here we know where the name Claflin came from in the letter here written by Isaac. And a photograph of those original founders. There you see Isaac seated on the far right. Ellen's brother, Isaac's brother-in-law, Joseph Dennison, first president, Bluemont Central College. Washington Marlott here, first principal. And the Marlott Homestead, which still stands today, is on the National Register. So when Bluemont Central College was demolished, I should back up, I apologize. The campus moved in 1875 to its current location. When it became Kansas State Agricultural College, 1863, it stood partially at the Bluemont College site. 1875 moved to the location we know today. So in 1883, they did demolish Bluemont Central College. And if you look up here, it's difficult to see in the photograph, but you can see Bluemont College. Well, Washington Marlott, I mentioned in the photograph here, in the newspapers it does document he purchased the stone and the timbers from the college and used that to construct his barn, which you see in the photograph there right next to the windmill. And after it was on the barn, it moved to Farrell Library on campus, and then ultimately it ended up in the Alumni Center, which you can see today. So you can see that Bluemont College, the 1859, the founding date. Wonderful piece of history that we can still see today. And I know I'm trying to get through this as quickly as I can. There's so much story to tell still, so I'm going to keep going here. I also wanted to mention, of course, many we know how much work Isaac put into founding the town, Bluemont Central College, but I also wanted to mention Ellen and her role. I love this quote. So Ellen, also an avid writer, She wrote, this is quote, "One thing I do believe, I should not stand acquitted in the great day, had I not been willing to join my husband in laboring for the freedom of this territory. It cost me great sacrifices in parting with loved ones far away, but I hope to find all of them, and an immeasurable multitude of others, made free both in body and in soul, made so by the feeble efforts of those that come here." She wrote this in 1855, and as I mentioned, I think it's just a beautiful quote. Also, we highlight Isaac, but the importance of Ellen and her role here as well. I will mention, so Isaac's brother, William, he also had a wife. His wife, Harriet, absolutely refused to come to Kansas. She was very happy in her comfortable life back in New England. But I will say, I think he had the last say because she is buried in Sunset Cemetery. So she did eventually make her way to Kansas. But I think that speaks to just these pioneers, and as Ellen mentioned, those sacrifices that were made to come here to help Kansas become a free state. So I also want to mention one of my absolute favorite Manhattan pioneers, Julia Lovejoy. So joining Isaac and Ellen Goodno's immigrant group was Reverend Charles Lovejoy and his pregnant wife Julia and their 3 children. A highly educated woman, Julia had an exceptional talent for writing, and we're fortunate to be able to learn about Julia's life through her detailed diary and newspaper editorials. So it was on the train leaving New England that Isaac met Reverend Charles Lovejoy and his wife Julia. At the time, Julia was 44 years old, 4 months pregnant, with 3 young children, as I had mentioned, coming out here to Kansas territory. So in Isaac's memories, he writes, quote, "His wife, Julia, was an intellectual woman, skilled in polemics, and amused us greatly by the way she handled in silence some of the skeptics who made themselves prominent in loud expressions of unbelief," referring to coming out here to Kansas. So I love that. Here's Isaac talking about Julia, to be able to have, it's when we start to see personality come out, it's very easy. You look at a photograph and you have to make assumptions. I wonder what this person was like, but when we can actually read what they wrote, I have a feeling that Julia was a pretty headstrong woman. So the trip to Kansas required a lengthy journey via train, steamboat, and wagon. Julia wrote to the Independent Democrat of Dover, New Hampshire, on board the Kate Swinney steamboat while on the Missouri River in March 13th, 1855. In the letter, Julia recounts their journey west. Quote, "Took the trains from Springfield, Massachusetts, and reached Albany, New York, then left with a large company from Massachusetts and Rhode Island for the, quote, land of promise. Arrived in Buffalo, then left for Toledo, Ohio. Next stopped Chicago, where they were able to partake in breakfast at 25 cents each. Left Chicago and traveled by horse and wagon over the Illinois prairies to Alton, Illinois. Then they boarded a steamboat to head down the Mississippi River to St. Louis. Additionally, Julia lamented the horrid effects of slavery that she witnessed en route to Kansas. She wrote, quote, "We could not resist the impression. The blighted effects of slavery was evident on this productive soil, as seen in the dilapidated buildings of the planters and on all you come in contact with." So what they observed undoubtedly strengthened their desire, Julia in particular, to help make Kansas a free state. The Lovejoys found lodging at the Mission Hotel in St. Louis around 3 o'clock Saturday morning. And this is an illustration here. This is in 1855. So looking at here's what St. Louis, and of course these illustrations are usually elaborated, but this gives you a sense of what St. Louis looked like in 1855 here. The family then found passage on the Kate Swinney steamboat from St. Louis to Kansas City for $10 each. So this fare would be around $260 per person today. The company aboard the steamboat consisted of around 100 men, women, and children from New England, as I had mentioned in speaking about Isaac Goodnow. Upon landing in Kansas City on March 18, 1855, Julia's husband, Charles, and son, Charles Jr., headed out west to what would become Manhattan with Isaac Goodnow's small group. Julia remained behind in Kansas City with her 2 daughters, Juliet and Edith, who both became very sick, Edith with measles. Julia recounts, quote, "We landed here in Kansas City on Sunday morning. What a desolate place. It is very sickly here in the hotel and in the town. many cases of death. Pneumonia seems to be the prevailing sickness. She goes on to say, our food is miserably cooked, so much so at times it produces a nauseating effect upon approaching the tables. Hundreds are arriving here weekly for the territory. All three of us are sick, and I know that we cannot live in this unhealthy atmosphere. Deaths almost or quite daily here. Sadness and discontent sit on the brow of every fresh arrival of immigrants, and scores come back here after wandering about the territory and spending nearly all or quite all their means, and take a boat for the return trip to St. Louis for New England again. So reading that, Julia's not having a good experience in Kansas territory, and unfortunately it only gets worse from here. But again, I like to share this because this is something, looking at Ella describing it as a sacrifice and what these pioneers did to come out here to Kansas. So Julia secured a teamster to help transport them via wagon to her journey to join her husband out west. On April 28th, Julia writes, I can stop here no longer. My little angel Edith groans terribly at night. She is in such pain. There is but one room in the log cabin where we are. This woman took her bed, dragged it out on the porch to sleep, for she said she could not sleep in the same house where the child groaned so. I have hired this man for $30 to carry us to the Big Blue if we do not meet Mr. Lovejoy on the way. That man with whom I agreed has put a drunken rowdy teamster in his stead to drive our team, and the horses will not draw the load. I fear Edith will not live to reach Lawrence. The carriage is very hard to ride in and jolts and jars us so badly. What shall I do? No human being that we ever saw before us showed any sympathy. The first night on our journey, an awful thunderstorm overtook us, and we leaped from the baggage wagon with Edith in our arms, as the awful peals of thunder were rending in the heavens and the rain falling in torrents and took shelter. That night, that miserable teamster crawled into our carriage, stole all our necessities that I had purchased in Kansas City for the journey. So it just keeps getting worse for Julia here. But thinking about, she's also 4 months pregnant, taking care of her children as she's coming out here. Upon reaching Lawrence, Julia's daughter Edith's condition had worsened, forcing Charles to leave Riley County by foot to head to Lawrence. So Julia wrote, about 4 o'clock in the evening, we came in sight of Lawrence and saw a man approaching us on foot. We held our breath, lest we might be deceived. Lo, 'tis he. We simultaneously uttered a cry, and the next moment we were sobbing in each other's arms. Mr. L. had arrived, and by some means learned that we were near, and ran to meet us. Oh, what had we both been through since we parted, and there was our dying child. So the following day, Julia writes, quote, can I proceed with my mournful story? The next day, May the 5th, we buried her dear little body at Lawrence with many tears. So the Lovejoys buried their 5-year-old daughter Edith on Mount Oread in Lawrence, Kansas. I can't imagine the heartbreak. You have left your family behind. Of course, I mentioned she's pregnant, she's taking care of her other children, and one passes away. And here she has to leave her child in a city she has no connection to and continue on. So here is Alexander Gardner's, his photograph of Mount Oread here in Lawrence, Kansas. So through this heartbreak, though, the Lovejoys continued west. She does say, we tore ourselves from the grave of our loved one, and sowing our tears along the road, went on our way toward the Big Blue. The 3rd day we reached there and went into a log cabin to live, with no floor, no windows. Tears were my meat and drink day and night, until sometimes it seemed, for no reason, I could not retain her throne unless my sorrows assuaged. So I just think, again, these passages are really illustrate what it was like coming out here to Kansas. So upon settling in Manhattan, Julia did seem to find some peace. In a letter she wrote to the Independent Democrat, May 22nd, 1855, she wrote, from the Big Blue River in Manhattan, Kansas Territory. Quote, we arrived at our intended home about 2 weeks ago, and notwithstanding the vacant spot in our home circle and our own desolate hearts, we must pronounce this the most charming spot and country our eyes ever beheld. It seems to us impossible that any spot on earth uncultivated by art can be more inviting in appearance than this country. Beautiful rolling prairies, like the waves of a sea, high limestone cliffs with immense stretches of bottom lands, reaching into thousands of acres. The only thing we have noticed as being lacking to make this country all that it needs to be is the scarcity of timber. So she does go on to say, quote, "Our company consists of men of the right stamp, mostly from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, including a number of ministers. They have picked a beautiful site for the city at the junction of the Big Blue and Kansas rivers. And today the surveyors are out of town site, busy staking out the streets on large scale, a number of miles in circumference." This is one of my favorite artifacts at the Riley County Historical Museum. This is Isaac Goodno's map. We know it's his. You can see his name in the top left corner there, Manhattan, Kansas. So this is after, and I'll mention briefly here, of course, the Hartford Steamboat, but this is such an incredible piece. This is 1856, the map of Manhattan. North, the map is tilted, north is actually this way. So here you can see the river, Points Avenue running right here. Some of the landmarks we have today, so even the city park, you can see it is marked in the 1856 map there, the same city park we have in our town today. So it's such a wonderful piece. I'm not sure if it is still on exhibit. It might have been, of course, being sensitive to light, it may have been rotated off. But if you have a chance to go by the museum to look at this, please do so. So at this time, Julia states that her husband has a stone house going up on the claim just beyond the city limits. But prior to that, they are living in what she describes as a cabin. Very likely it was a sod house type cabin. This is an 1860s photograph here of a Riley County sod house. In parts of her diary too, I wanted to mention, of course it would take another 5 programs to go through just how many incredible entries she has, but she talks about after she does have her baby, she's sitting in the window and a bobcat jumps up on a log next to the window while she has her baby right there, her baby Roscoe by the window. She talks about the snakes that intrude on her on a daily basis. So just the descriptive nature of what she experienced is just wonderful. I also, she had the windows open, so no. She does note that. The windows are open, this bobcat comes and jumps right there while she has her child right by the window. She does mention that game is very plentiful about the Blue. Wild geese, ducks, turkeys, prairie chickens, and deer abound. The streams are full of fish of the finest flavor I have ever tasted. She mentions catfish over 50 pounds and sometimes twice that size. So again, this is one of those early views of Points Avenue. This is around 1863. You can see the river here, and then one of the early hotels here, which Susan B. Anthony actually spoke at, which is another wonderful piece of history. But looking down Points Avenue there, so looking at what it might have looked like, of course, is a little later of when Julia was here, but just to give you an idea of Manhattan at the time. Here's the Blue River, which I just mentioned that she spoke about in her diary. But she also mentions in her letters a steamboat from Cincinnati, Ohio, which made its way to Riley County, Kansas in June of 1855. Originally on its way to Junction City to start a town, or the Junction City area, excuse me, to start a town, the steamboat ran aground near the Lovejoys in Goodno's settlement of New Boston at the confluence of the Blue and Kansas rivers. The group decided to stay with the New Boston settlement under the condition that they would rename the town to Manhattan, as one of the primary financiers of the steamboat venture was from Manhattan, New York. Aboard the steamboat were around 100 passengers and 10 prefabricated homes that were constructed by the Hinkle and Guild Company out of Cincinnati. In 1855, these one-room, so they were about 14-foot by 18-foot homes, sold for $85, which would have around the buying power today of $2,500, to give you an idea. Aboard that steamboat, so I'll kind of make a long story. I know I've only got a few more minutes here. So the steamboat, after they combined forces, decided to name the town Manhattan. It was on its way back, and it ran aground near St. Mary's. Somehow, and it has been debated, how the steamboat caught fire. Of course, many of those steamboats did not fare well on the rivers today. How many of them sank in the next photograph, another example. But somehow this steamboat caught on fire and burned. One of the only things salvaged from that steamboat was the bell. And that bell, you can see in the photograph today, that does hang in the lobby of the Riley County Historical
I
Museum.
think there are a bunch of barrels of whiskey with it too.
That has been rumored, yes. Well, and that's why I wanted to show, I'm not sure if anybody has been to the Arabia Steamboat Museum in Kansas City. One of my it's incredible favorite museums. So the Arabia Steamboat sank in 1856, so just a year after the Hartford Steamboat sank. But I love it because it gives us an idea of what the Hartford Steamboat would have carried as it came out here to Manhattan. And the Arabia Steamboat, as I understand it, had 2 prefab houses, while the Hartford Steamboat had 10. And I haven't been there since, it's been maybe 4 or 5 years. But from what I understand, they were working on putting one of the prefab houses that they found on this Arabia Steamboat. They were going to erect that house in the museum there. But if you've been there, you know, it's just, everything was so beautifully preserved as it sank. It became a cornfield. So it was, as I understand, refrigerator repairmen that figured out a way to get this steamboat to safely dig it up and preserve it. And last I heard, they were about 85%, so this happened in the 1980s. They're about 85% through processing everything that was found on the steamboat. So very tedious process, but I love it as that comparison to the Hartford Steamboat, give us an idea of what that might have been like here. And I'm gonna skip ahead, I'm so sorry, I guess I was gonna try to get through this as quickly as I could here. So Julia says in her diary, things now look quite city-like, and the sound of the hammer is heard on every hand. 9 of their houses are already erected. 25 or more habitations of one kind or another are now dotting this broad area, known as city limits, and for miles around, the claims are mostly taken up. We have purchased and moved into one of these Cincinnati houses, furnished, and what she refers to as in the ends of the earth, as our friends at home say, with better furniture than it has been our fortune heretofore to possess. So here we know Julia Lovejoy, she actually lived in one of these Hartford houses. So I'm gonna skip ahead here. So here she says, May 5th, 1856, Great Bend of the Blue, in a little cabin hastily thrown together. This is now our home. We have occupied a balloon house, a so-called ready-made, brought on the ill-fated steamer Hartford that was burnt to the water's edge on her downward trip from Manhattan to Lawrence. In this house last winter, our family near freezing. The cold was so intense.